So this is going to be the first installment of a series of videos that I'm planning to do called the Dragon Ball Head Scratchers. Now, these are going to be things from the Dragon Ball universe, whether it be from the manga, the anime, GT, the 90s movies, the current movies, Super, basically all the incarnations of the franchise that make me scratch my head. Questions that I have about the series that aren't really explained, that are kind of wonky in the explanations that we have, or that are somewhat contradicted. And the first thing that I will be discussing today is Frieza's forms. Now, we all know Frieza. He is probably the most iconic villain of the Z era, at least, and probably the most iconic villain in all of Dragon Ball. Of course, there's Cell, there's King Piccolo, there's Majin Buu, but Frieza, I think it's still safe to say that he is still the most popular and is still most widely regarded, and probably one of the most well-known anime/manga villains out there. And Frieza kind of introduces, well, the concept of transformations has always existed in Dragon Ball. In fact, Goku is the first person who does perform a transformation when he looks at the full moon in Emperor Pilaf's castle. He turns into an Ozaru, and he pretty much demolishes the whole place. And for a long time, Goku is the only character who actually has a full-on, complete transformation. Then this concept starts being brought back, with the Saiyans, when Vegeta also turns into a great ape, which we find out is a trait that all Saiyans have. Then Gohan transforms into it, actually before Vegeta even. Then we have Zarbon, but then really the character who starts the big trend of transformations for the rest of the Z era and the current stuff, for better or for worse, is Frieza. Frieza has over 4 forms. Actually, he got a 5th one, that's why I said over 4. But in the original manga, he has 4 forms. And these forms, as explained in the series, exist so that Frieza can control his power easier. The concept behind Frieza's strength is that Frieza and his father, as it's been explained by Akira Toriyama fairly recently, is that they are genetic freaks of their species. That even though the rest of Frieza's family, whether or not that means Cooler exists or whatever, if Frieza has a brother or an extended family, it's hinted at that he does, at least by statements of Toriyama. It's stated that even amongst his entire family, and even next to his father, Frieza was always born with an abnormally large power level, and he is, thus far, the only non-god who has attained a level of power where he can actually hurt a god. And I mean a god when he's using a significant portion of his power, as we see in Resurrection F. And that is kind of a testament to Frieza's own strength. Now, what happens in the manga, anyway, is that Frieza is so powerful ever since his birth that he never trained, and he is so powerful that he actually has to invent entirely new versions of himself in order to control his great power, because he cannot sense ki, and even in Resurrection F, I don't believe he can do it even there. And because he has this kind of lousy control over his power, he has to create these lesser forms of himself in order to keep himself in check, or else he'd run the risk of annihilating a planet that he wants, or maybe annihilating his own men, or just causing general havoc and destruction that he otherwise wants to avoid for whatever reason. And the first form of Frieza we see is, of course, a small, stocky form where he kind of looks very effeminate. He's not very physically imposing, but at the time, he was the strongest guy on Namek. Even though Vegeta was getting power-ups, Gohan and Krillin were getting power-ups, Goku was getting power-ups on his way to Namek, Frieza was still incredibly powerful, so much so that his first form has a power level of about 530,000. The last power level from Frieza that we hear in the manga itself is in his second form, which is 1 million. Then we never get a clear power level number for his third form, which kind of looks like a xenomorph, of course, and it's very possible that that was inspired by it. I don't know. I'm not going to say that as a fact, but of course, he looks like a xenomorph. You can't deny that. Anyway, going back to his power level, is that Frieza's third form has never been given an official power as far as I know, but generally people say that he's at 2 million. Then his third form is at 3 million, and his maximum power, as stated by the Daizenshu, I believe, is 120 million. The problem with this whole concept that I find kind of weird, and that's the point I'm making for this video, is that when you really think about it, Frieza has 4 different levels of power just so he can control 1%, roughly 1 to 2% of his overall strength. As I said, Frieza's power at his absolute peak in the manga, in his full biological body, before Mecha Frieza, before Golden Frieza, before all that other stuff, is 150 million. His first form's power level is 530,000. His second form is at 1 million. His third form is probably at 2 million, given the fact that he's able to completely curb stomp Piccolo, and his third form is likely at 3 million because he can beat the shit out of Vegeta, who was even stronger than both Piccolo and Frieza's previous level. And so when you really think about it, Frieza has like 4 different forms just to control a insignificant portion of his strength. Now, the reason why I think this was done is that Toriyama likely didn't really think about power levels that much after this. Now, I'm one of the people who subscribes to the whole idea that even at the Majin Buu saga, Toriyama still had a kind of a rough idea of where everybody was in correlation to one another. Whether or not he still has that today is up for debate, but I still say that even if he completely abandoned the power levels as a concept in universe, I still think he had an idea of where everybody stood in parallel to one another as the manga went on, even though there's nothing really there to confirm it. And when you really look at this whole situation, you just gotta feel that that's kind of weird, that Frieza has so many forms just to control an insignificant level of his own strength. You would think that it would make a lot more sense that Frieza in his first form can only use like under 1%, and then when he transforms into his second form, he can say control up to 25%, and then in his third form, he can control up to 50%. And then in his final form, he can control from 50 to 100%, or 75 to 100%. Anyway, dividing the power by 4, and so you would think that would make more sense. However, as I said before, I think that Toriyama didn't want power levels to become too crazy, because Frieza's whole transformation thing begins a long series of events that kind of trigger this whole cliche in Dragon Ball where characters just get power-ups because they need to get power-ups, otherwise they're going to get completely annihilated by the bad guy. The Namek Saga is where that stuff happens constantly. Vegeta fights somebody, he gets beat up, and then when he comes back healed, he has a power-up, and then he beats the shit out of the guy who almost murdered him last time, and then that happens to him again and again and again, and he keeps abusing it so he can keep fighting on with Frieza. Then Piccolo shows up out of, from King Kai's planet, and then he fuses with some Namekian over a fusion thing, and then he has a power level of over 1 million, enough to take on second form Frieza in his second form, of course. And so I think that from an out-universe perspective, the answer is clearly that Toriyama maybe wanted to toy with the idea that Frieza actually controls larger sums of power, given his various forms, but Toriyama deliberately nerfs this idea or completely abandons this idea in favor of the one he goes with in the actual storyline, so that the characters, even though they're getting ass-pull power-ups from left and right, that they still are at least somewhat plausible. Because if my whole idea where Frieza's power levels drastically increase after every form, then you'd run into the problem of having to just give characters even more ridiculous power increases out of nowhere. Otherwise, they would be completely massacred. Now, you could say that Toriyama could have just kept the powers down, so instead of Frieza's maximum being 120 million, his maximum can be like 12 million. So he can still divide his power and give himself good chunks of power increases between those forms without making power levels completely insane. And that's a perfectly valid explanation, but I think from an outer universe answer or perspective, I think that this is why he did it this way. Now, for what an in-universe explanation is, I can't really say. The closest thing I can come to is that Frieza has completely shitty control over his own power, so that even though he might have wanted to divide it up better, he couldn't, I suppose, because, like I said, Frieza's first 3 forms are not his real bodies. They are these restrained bodies, new versions of himself that he created to keep himself in check, because his power is so vast that if he was constantly at his maximum, he could probably cause devastating annihilation, which could be bad for business, and he would unintentionally, destroy his own men or potentially valuable planets. Um, and so that could be, you kind of viewed as an answer for this question. That Frieza never thought that he would actually need to use anywhere near the amount of power that he actually ends up using on Namek, that he just figures that dividing up his lower millions by several forms is going to be more than enough to compensate for any problems. And so even if any guy shows up who can beat him in his first, second, third, and maybe even early fourth form, he can still have a large sum of power left over for himself to ensure his own victory. And Frieza has actually been shown to psychologically fuck with his enemies, and so it's entirely possible that Frieza could have divided his power up into bigger chunks, but chose not to, because he wants to psychologically torture his enemies. And this kind of works to great effect in the Namek saga, because when they meet Frieza, he's, of course, at 530,000. Then he tells them he's at 1 million. And then he tells them, well, he doesn't tell them his third form's power, but it's implied that his power is increased once again significantly, and then even more in his fourth form. And then when you think Frieza's, done, like he can't get any stronger, he comes out and says, oh, this is but merely 3% of my true power. It will take 50% to annihilate you. And I know that was a horrible posh accent, but that's kind of what he sounds like anyway. But going back to the topic at hand, I think you guys get my point, that Frieza maybe intentionally divided his lower power levels because he, one, thought that he would never actually need to use anywhere near his maximum or even half against anyone, because as far as Frieza was concerned, his dad was the only guy who's kind of on his level, and Captain Ginyu was a close second to him, but even Captain Ginyu is nowhere near his first form. So Frieza never really saw any point in properly mathematically dividing his strength. And when you really think about it, telling your enemy, oh, I have four forms that all increase my power, and then when this guy who's, fighting you in your fourth form, you can just come out and tell him, oh, you thought this is my maximum? Oh, no, motherfucker, I have, a shitload more power left, which is what happens to Goku. Goku doesn't believe this guy when he says that he still has so much power left in reserve. And even after Goku uses a times 20 Kaioken, he still can't believe that Frieza has even more power stored away. So I guess that could be viewed as an in-universe explanation, that Frieza never really saw a point in properly dividing up his power, and that he did it deliberately as a way to psychologically fuck with any potential adversaries that could force him into situations where he would need his higher levels of strength. So yeah, what are you guys' opinions on the forums? Have I just been rambling for 15 minutes without making any sort of sense, or did I actually present my points in a somewhat coherent manner? Tell me what you guys think about, why Frieza divided his power the way he did. Tell me your theories. Did I miss anything? Did I miss any crucial information? Please, tell me down in the comments below. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, because I'm planning to do at least several of them in the coming days, before college starts back up. So yeah, if you're, like seeing me talk about Dragon Ball, let me know, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.